Yeah, right. All right. Good evening, everyone. L'chaim. We are now 2 weeks away from Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, 2 weeks away now. 2 weeks from tomorrow night is Rosh Hashanah, so time to double down in our preparations. And as some of you may have joined me, as we studied earlier today, to prepare by making a calculation in all areas of Yiddishkeit, the three pillars of Judaism being Torah, prayer, and good deeds, and we have to strengthen all of those. So tonight we get to study and strengthen the commitment to Torah leading into the new year. So, Chaim. It's time to take on a new. Yes, absolutely. So I know last week this will be the last time we're gonna conclude the discussion of Tractate Sota today. We've been jumping around a little bit because the last few pages of Tractate Sota are very extensive, and there's a lot of Agadata, a lot of I'd say sections of the Talmud which are I'm not sure what's the right word to use over here, but a lot of what's called Agadata. So I'm picking and choosing different sections. It's not a halachic text. If it was halachic text, I wouldn't skip around. But it's different stories and discussions of the tragedy of the destruction of the temple. And as we've been pointing out, the what we call Yuridas Hadoros, how the world has declined since the destruction of the temple. So that's really what the last few pages of Sota talk about. So I'll kind of jump around a little bit. Today we'll learn some fascinating episodes in history connected to the Gemara. So one of the things the Mishnah says on Mem Ches Amud Aleph 48a, it talks about when certain things concluded, so we lost certain values. Like, for example, it says when the Sanhedrin ceased to function, so song was abolished from the wine feasts, which is interesting. If you look in the Talmud seems to say that once the temple was destroyed, song or music is forbidden. And the Talmud even goes on to say the problems with music. So how do you reconcile what the Talmud says, that song is forbidden once the destruction of the temple, because we should not pursue joy if the temple is destroyed, we're in exile, with the fact that there's plenty of music out there, plenty of Jewish music out there. So the commentaries explain that the truth is that nowadays the only appropriate music is music which is being performed with some level of divinity to it. So music just for the sake of pleasure, the Talmud says, is inappropriate in exile. That has to be saved from Mashiach comes to redemption, when holiness is where it's supposed to be. But in a state of destruction, just as we all can appreciate, although today there's very little respect given to mourning, right? You go to a Shiva house nowadays, unfortunately, it looks like a party. It is a party. That's a terrible mistake. A Shiva house is meant to be a place where you pay respect not only to the mourners, but you pay respect to those who have those who have passed on. The fact that a Shiva house has turned into a party scene is a shanda, exactly. Instead of at a Shiva house where they had an open bar. I mean, yeah, a Shiva house with an open bar.
Valley Park.
Yeah, all right, valet parking is not the end of the world. Valet parking would just mean there's a lot of parking. But if there's a valet parking, I can accept. But having an open bar at a Shiva house, that's already entirely inappropriate. So perhaps today it can be said that we don't value respect mourning whatsoever. But assuming we can appreciate the fact that it's inappropriate to have a party taking place at a Shiva house, essentially the Gemara is saying that as long as we're in exile, we are in a state of mourning. We're in a state of, whether you call it Shiva or Avelos, we're in a state of mourning for the temple. And if that's the case, you should not be enjoying music. So how do we reconcile music? The answer is, again, that if music just for the sake of music and enjoyment, that is inappropriate according to the Talmud. But if it's music, which also has a component of serving Hashem, and generally speaking, all Jewish music, or I'd say the vast majority of Jewish music, is verses from the Torah, includes messages of inspiration. So you may also enjoy it, but because it's part of, it connects a person and brings a person closer to Hashem, such music is okay. So music which has a spiritual component to it, that would be appropriate. Music which is purely and only pleasure and enjoyment is inappropriate. Fine. But then the Mishnah goes on to say something else. Mishemesu neviim harishonim, when the early prophets died, batlu urim v'tumim. The urim and v'tumim ceased to be operational. So this quote raises two questions. One is, who are Nevi'im Rishonim? Who are the early prophets? And the second is, what is the Urim V'tumim? What is that Urim V'tumim which was canceled, which was annulled after Nevi'im Rishonim? We'll get to that in a moment. And then the Mishnah goes on and says, Mishacharav Beis HaMikdash, when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Batal HaShamir, the Shamir was annulled, was canceled. So what is this Shamir? One of the presidents of Israel was Shamir. What is this Shamir mean? Construction company. Fine. So let's discuss some of these statements over here and what they mean as the Gemara gets into it. Says the Gemara, what exactly, as the Gemara quotes the Mishnah on 48b, Mishemeisum Nevi'im Arishonim, when the first prophets died, what does it say? The Batal Urim V'tumim. The Urim V'tumim ceased to exist. Man Nevi'im Arishonim, who are the early prophets? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna says, Zed David u'Shmuel. The early prophets are David and Shmuel and Shlomo. David HaMelech, Shmuel v'Shlomo. So King David, King Shlomo was his son. Shmuel was the prophet who lived in the times of Shaul HaMelech and David HaMelech. He says those are the early prophets. And when they died, the Urim V'tumim ceased to exist. What is the Urim V'tumim? So the Urim V'tumim was a unique form of information. Today, if you have a question, you go to Google, right? You Google, it's become a word. You Google with whatever question you have. Times the Beis HaMikdash. What's that? Yeah, it was the earliest technology. The earliest information technology was the Urim V'tumim, and it was openly miraculous. And basically, the Urim V'tumim was that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore a unique breastplate with the stones on it, and within the beneath it there was a folded paper. I guess it was parchment with the name of God on it. And the technology, the way it worked was that if there was a question that they could not have a proper answer to, in other words, generally speaking, when it comes to Torah, we don't turn to God for answers when it comes to Torah. We have a system. We have a system of sages, system of deriving things. But certain questions the sages couldn't answer. Question like, should we or should we not go to war? That's not necessarily a halachic question. So no, there's no halachic answer to that. That's more of a divine question. So the prophet or the king or the Kohen Gadol would pose the question in the presence of the Urim V'tumim, in the presence of the Choshen, the breastplate with the stones, which had within it the papers with God, with the pages with God's name on it, and he was wearing it. Correct? He was wearing it. Was in, and then the answer would light up on the Urim V'tumim. The stones or the letters on the stones, which were to spell out the answer, would light up. So it was a miraculous, and obviously miraculous system. And according to the first answer of the Gemara, that system only worked until King Solomon. King Solomon, who built the first Beis HaMikdash, and then after he passed away, the Urim V'tumim no longer was effective. So from the time of the giving of Torah, the first Kohen Gadol was Aaron, the giving of Torah, until Shlomo HaMelech was how long? Approximately 500 years. So it worked for 500 years, then it stopped working. Wait, the Shamir is something else. We'll get to that in a moment. Right now we're talking about the Urim V'Tumim. Yeah, correct. Very good. Now, the Rav Nachman says that already in the times of King David, the Urim V'Tumim was only somewhat affected. In other words, what he says a story. What is it? So it's almost like you have today, again, using like the internet, right? Sometimes you just have bad service. Like, you refresh and it works, and then you get really frustrated when it doesn't work. Not to make light of the Urim V'Tumim, but he says sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. What does he say? Where do you see this? From the stories in the Tanakh. Because we have an episode which is as follows. In the book of Shmuel, Shmuel 2, chapter 15, verse number 24, we have one of the great challenges of David HaMelech's life. David HaMelech lived a very challenging life. Even though he's perhaps our greatest king, he lived a very challenging life. And I've shared this before, that to my knowledge in Jewish history, we don't find someone who was pursued both by his father-in-law to be killed and his son to be killed. So you have his father-in-law wanted to kill him, that was Shaul. And later, much later on in his life, his son Avshalom wanted to kill him as well. So he had, talk about family tzaras, right? He had family tzaras. And at the end of his life with Avshalom, Avshalom was chasing David HaMelech, and David HaMelech ran away to Yerushalayim. I'm sorry, he ran from Yerushalayim. And at this point, he had a question about how to deal with the situation. He was in war, he was in flight, and he wanted to ask the Urim V'Tumim. The Kohen Gadol was with him. He said, let me pose the question to the Urim V'Tumim, because the Kohen Gadol, whose name was Evyasar, had accompanied him as he ran away from Yerushalayim. Even though the Kohen Gadol is typically in Yerushalayim, Evyasar had joined him in flight from his son, Avshalom. And so David HaMelech asked the high priest Evyasar if he could pose the question to the Urim V'Tumim of what to do next. Evyasar posed the question, and he didn't get an answer. There was no answer forthcoming for Evyasar. So at this point, David HaMelech said, are there any, looked around, and he saw there was another Kohen among the group there who had joined him, and this Kohen's name was Sadok. And he turns to Sadok, he says, why don't you try eliciting an answer for the Urim V'Tumim? Sadok. And he does. Sadok. And he does elicit an answer from, he asks the question, and he gets an answer from the Urim V'Tumim. And David HaMelech firstly got his answer, but secondly determined that this was proof that Tzadok was the right one to be the Kohen Gadol. And therefore he demoted Evyasar and promoted Tzadok to be the Kohen Gadol. If I'm not mistaken, it's about this Tzadok that it is said that all Kohanim are descendants of Tzadok. This Tzadok became all Kohen Gadol were descendants of that Tzadok, who was promoted to be Kohen Gadol. This is not to be confused with the much later Tzadok, who was the founder of the Sadducees. Sadducees, which were a group that rejected rabbinic Judaism. Sadducee is also from the word Tzadok. Sadducee comes from Tzadok, and that was a later, much later Tzadok. That was a student of that was already towards the very end of the first temple, and that led a movement away from Judaism, Sadducees. So you have Tzadok, the high priest, and I remember hearing that all Kohanim today are descendants of Tzadok. Somehow that rings a bell. I'm a Kohen, so it's pretty relevant to me. But regardless, all Kohanim Gedolim, all the high priests were descendants of this Tzadok. But the Gemara basically saying that you see the Urim V'Tumim during the times of David HaMelech was already shaky. That it worked to some degree, it didn't work. It worked for some, but not for others. And then the Gemara brings another opinion which says that we find an episode much later where the Urim V'Tumim was, and therefore it would seem that when the Mishnah says the early prophets ceased, that so too ceased the Urim V'Tumim, it seems to be much later. Not just David and Shlomo, who are at the very beginning of the temple, but rather prophets throughout the next several hundred years continued to use the Urim V'Tumim. And that's what the Gemara concludes, that rather, Nevi'im Rishonim, the early prophets, actually means all of the prophets leading up to with the exception of the final three prophets. Who are the final, it's good Jewish trivia, who are the final three prophets of the Jewish people? The final three known prophets or were listed as part of the prophets. They are Haggai, Zechariah.
Micah.
Go ahead.
Micah?
Malachi.
Oh,
no,
Malachi.
Malachi.
Yeah.
Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi are considered to be, they're the ones who are towards the same time as Ezra, leading the Jewish people back to rebuild the second temple. As they were there also, this is the era of Mordechai and Ezra. Daniel, a little after Daniel, what? Yeah, they are part of the tray. They are included in the tray Aser in the prophets. So according to the first opinion, Gemara says the Nevi'im Rishonim, the early prophets, are the early prophets, like Shmuel and David and Shlomo. The second opinion says no, the early prophets means all the prophets, with the exception of the final three of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Then the Gemara says, when Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi died, when those three prophets died, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael, then Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirits, departed from Israel. The Afal Pikain, but even when the divine spirit departed, Hoyu Mishtamshin Bebaskol, we still come across heavenly voices, a heavenly voice which sometimes would be spoken and would be heard. So you see, you have this gradual process. First, you have prophecy. First, the ultimate prophet is Moshe. Moshe has prophecy like no other. But let's take a step back. We all experience prophecy. The giving of Torah was a moment in which we all experienced prophecy. And then the prophecy after Moshe, there was never a prophecy like Moshe. And then you have the diminishment of the prophecy after the earlier prophets. You still had the Urim V'Tumim. Then you had the final prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, after which it says there wasn't really what we call Ruach HaKodesh, divine spirit. But even then, there continued to be heavenly voices which were sometimes heard. And the Gemara goes on to share examples in which heavenly voices were heard. For example, Gemara says, Shapa Machas. It happened once. Hayu Mesubin ba'aliyas beis Guria be'Yericho. The sages of the time were gathered in the attic of a man named Guria in his house who lived in Jericho. So he lived in Yericho, and the sages were gathered in his attic. And suddenly, Nitna Alehem Baskom and Hashemayim, they heard a heavenly voice from heaven that stated as follows, V'amra, which stated, Yesh bachem Adam Echad, there sits among you one person, Shera'oi Shetishra Shechina Alav, who is worthy of prophecy. Ela she'ein doiroi ro'i lakach, but his generation is not worthy of prophecy. In other words, fascinating idea, that the heavenly voice said, among you there is someone here who is worthy of being a prophet. But to be a prophet, it's not enough to have accomplished that on your own. Your generation has to be supportive of it. You have to be in a generation which is worthy of prophecy. And the generation is not worthy, even though there's someone here sitting that is worthy. What's interesting is the Baskol then didn't identify who. He just said there's someone here worthy of prophecy. Why not? Why doesn't the why doesn't the voice identify? And it is so and so. So one answer given is that there's a concept in Judaism that when one shares praise for someone, you only say, if it's in front of them, you only say some of their praise. You don't speak a person's full praise in their presence. You praise someone, you praise some. So the way to do it is you say, I'm praising you. And by the way, that what I'm saying is only a small amount. There's much more, which I'm not saying. So it's over here that the God was following that rule by giving some praise, but not identifying the person, which would be too much praise for a person in their presence. Okay. But the sages looked around the room, and everyone's like, oh, who is this? Who is the person here? Nasnu einehem behillel hazakin. And the eyes all settled on Hillel. Somehow they all understood that he was the one about whom that heavenly voice was talking about. Ukishemes, and when Hillel Hazakin died, hispiduhu, they eulogized him, and they said, "Hey Chassid, hey Anav, whoa, what a pious man he was! Whoa, what a humble man he was!" Talmido shel Ezra, following in the footsteps of the great Ezra. Literally means a student of Ezra, but Hillel lived many hundreds of years after Ezra. A couple hundred years after Ezra. So therefore it says, following in the footsteps of Ezra. Another situation, a very almost identical story. They were gathered in an attic. This time it was in Yavna. Sages were gathered in Yavna. And again, a heavenly voice was heard. Nitna lehem baskom min hashamayim. A heavenly voice was heard. V'amra lahen. And the heavenly voice said, Yesh b'chem adam echad, there sits among you one person, shera'ui shetishra shchina alav, who is deserving that God's divine of prophecy. But again, el she'ein doiroi zakoin lakach, but the generation is not meritorious enough. Which again, you could have a person in any generation who has reached the pinnacle of holiness, but the generation is not worthy. That person may not receive the level of holiness that someone else in a better generation would. Nasnu einayim, at this point, they all looked around and their eyes settled on Shmuel HaKatan. Shmuel, who is known as Shmuel, the small one. Katan means small one. Why was he known as Shmuel, the small one? Because he was humble. He had such humility that he was referred to as the Shmuel, the small one. Ukishemes hispiduhu, and when he died, they gave him the same eulogy. Hey Anav, hey Chassid, Talmida shel Hillel. Here's the righteous one, the humble one, the student of Hillel. Va'afhu, and to show the divine providence that he had. When he was dying, he said at the time of his death, he said, Shimon v'Yishmael acharba. Soon, he says, pretty soon afterwards, he said, Shimon, the great Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yishmael are going to be killed by the sword. We read about this on Yom Kippur. They're part of the 10 martyrs. The Chavrohi Liktala, and their colleagues will be put to death by other means. V'shar Ama Leviza, and then the rest of the nation will be laid to spoil. Ve'akan Sagin Asidin Lemesi Al Ama, and terrible tragedies will befall the Jewish people. So Shmuel HaKatan was able to see how sometime in the future, I don't know exactly how long after Shmuel HaKatan's passing was the destruction of the temple and the tragedies he predicted, but he was able to have that divine knowledge. Basically saying, even though perhaps the clarity of prophecy didn't exist, but divine knowledge did exist, and heavenly voices continued to convey messaging, and that wasn't completely gone. Fine. Let me jump ahead a little bit. To the next Mishnah. And over here it talks about, again, different rulings that were issued due to certain tragedies that took place in the Jewish faith. Here's the Mishnah, Memtes Medala 49a. Bipulmos shel Aspasionos. Aspasionos is the English wording for Vespasian. During Vespasian's campaign against Jerusalem, Gazru al Etres Chasanim, the sages decreed that grooms should no longer wear a wreath on their head. They used to wear that. It used to be a form of celebration. Va'al ha'irus. Irus is also a type of crown that was worn by the chassan. Irus was a musical instrument. Irus was a musical instrument. They said you can no longer use the irus. Bipulmus shel Titus, during the campaign of Titus, Gazru al Itris Kalos, they made a ban on the bride's wreaths. V'shalo yilamed as benoi Yivanis, and that no one should teach their son Greek. Fine. I want to hear, and then the Gemara goes on to talk about certain things, qualities which cease to exist when certain sages died. Mishameis Rabbi Meir, once Rabbi Meir died, Batlu Moshli Mishalim, there ceased to be composers of parables. Rabbi Meir was someone who was able to teach by virtue of parables. The ability to give a proper parable is not a minor ability. It allows a person to teach. A parable is the ability to take an idea which is abstract and perhaps too difficult to understand, and by sharing a proper parable, that becomes the gateway to understand a deeper idea. In fact, it says Shlomo HaMelech, the great wisdom of King Solomon was that he can give 2,000 parables. Each parable was another way of taking a very complex idea and bringing it down a level lower, so that everyone can understand, which is a very interesting appreciation of wisdom. Wisdom is not the ability to understand that which no one can understand. The greatest wisdom is to be able to bring down that which is inexplicable to most and allow people to understand. So in Judaism, the greatest wisdom is not that one can rise above everyone else in understanding, but rather the person who can draw down the very deepest ideas to the level where the rest of us can appreciate it. So that ability to do so through Mishalim was something Rabbi Meir was able to do, and when he died, that ability no longer existed. Mishemes ben Azai, when Ben Azai died, Batlu hashakdanim, those who are diligent, not shakranim, which would be liars. Shakdanim are those who are the diligent scholars, no longer existed after Ben Azai passed away. He was the last of the true diligent Torah scholars. Mishemes ben Zoma batla darshanim. Once Ben Zoma died, the experts in deriving lessons from Torah no longer existed. Mishemes Rabbi Akiva batal kvod haTorah. Once Rabbi Akiva died, the glory of Torah ceased to exist. The commentaries explain in what way was Rabbi Akiva, how did he show kavod haTorah more than anyone else? So it says that most people, when we think about Torah, so most throughout history, we've pointed out how Torah is precise. And it's precise because you can appreciate the value of every single word of Torah. It takes tremendous wisdom to appreciate the value of every word. And when you do that, when you recognize that you're giving the greatest honor to Torah, the greatest honor of Torah is recognizing that every word teaches us lessons. Rabbi Akiva not only was able to understand the depth of the importance, significance of every word, but even every letter. Sometimes there's a word which could have an extra letter, which you would think would be pronounced the same without it. Every letter, Rabbi Akiva was able to derive the value of every letter. But more than that, if you look in the Torah scroll, there's something called tagin. Tagin are the crowns on top of the letter. Look in the Torah; it's very. That's what takes a scribe so long. Is there's crowns on certain letters? There are crowns. The crowns don't all look the same. There's three pronged crown, two pronged crowns. Rabbi Akiva not only derived the meaning of every word, not only derived the meaning of every letter in Torah, but was able to derive the meaning of every crown. He says there's no such thing as extra ink in the Torah. If there's a crown, next time you get an aliyah at the Torah, you read from the Torah, take a moment to look at the crowns on the letters. Rabbi Akiva expounded the significance of every crown on the Torah. So much so that there is a fascinating medrash which says that Moshe Rabbeinu had a vision. Moses. And the vision, God transported him 1,000 years into the future. And he was transported into a classroom, and he was sitting in the classroom. Who was teaching? Rabbi Akiva. So he was teaching, and Rabbi Akiva was teaching, and he was expounding on the crowns, on the letters, and Moshe Rabbeinu was fascinated, but he was also upset. He turns to God, he says, he's teaching things I don't even know. And I'm the one who gives the Torah. I'm the one who conveyed the Torah to the people. How can he be teaching things that I don't know if the Torah came through me? So God said, just listen a little bit more. And finally, he said something, and one of the students said, where do you know this? He said, we know this all from Moshe at Sinai. Rabbi Akiva answered. So the message that God was saying is that you are conveying a wisdom which you may not even know all of the depth of the wisdom that you are passing on to the people. And God says to Moshe, yes, it is called the 5 books of Moses, which means you are sharing that, you are teaching that. But within the Torah that you are teaching, there contains secrets which even you don't know. Imagine someone gave you, I don't know, a bunch of materials, and you pass that on to your child or to your student, and they take those materials and they develop it further, and they develop things which even you aren't aware of. But it's all thanks to you. You're the one who gave it to them. You're the one who gave them the materials. You're the one who gave them the tools. They used your tools, your materials, your methodology to then come up with new ideas. But it's all thanks to you. So Moshe Rabbeinu was comforted by Hashem by Hashem telling him that, yes, Rabbi Akiva is teaching things that even you don't know. But where does he get it from? To whom does he give credit? To you, because the Torah came through you. Obviously, all Torah comes back to Hashem, but the Torah came through Moshe. But all this comes back to the fact that Rabbi Akiva showed the ultimate honor of Torah. You don't know the ultimate honor of Torah is? The recognition that every dot in the Torah, every letter, every word carries deep, profound significance. And therefore, when Rabbi Akiva died, it says the true honor of Torah died with him, because no one since then has been able to elaborate and expound upon every letter and dot and crown in the Torah scroll. Fine. That's Rabbi Akiva. The next person, it's almost we go from one area of greatness to an entirely different area of greatness. This next person who the Mishnah talks about is a man named Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. The Gemara says, Misha Meis Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. When Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa died, Batlu Anshe Maisa. There ceased to be people of good deeds. So unlike Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva is the ultimate teacher. We have very few teachers like Rabbi Akiva in history. The Torah as we have it today is thanks in large part to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is not known for his teaching. Is not known for the Torah that he taught. In fact, if you look in the Mishnah, you won't come across Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa at all, other than one time. So you don't come across Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa in the Mishnah, but rather he was the epitome of righteousness. He wasn't the teacher of Klal Yisrael, but he was the example of what it means to be holy. I'll share over here in the Art Scroll, shares a few stories about Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, which illustrate his holiness. And more importantly, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa was known to be an open miracle worker. He was an open miracle worker. So here are some of the stories which are shared about Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. This is from the Gemara Tainus. One story is like this. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa had a neighbor who built a house, but then found that the beams she had prepared for the roof were not long enough to span from wall to wall. She came to Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa and said, I've built a house, but the beams can't reach the opposite wall. Imagine you build a house, and then to support the house, you need beams to go across the building. And she miscalculated that the beams weren't long enough. And he asked her, what is your name? She said, Aiku. And he said, Aiku, let the beams lengthen. And the beams miraculously lengthened until they spanned the entire roof and extended a cubit beyond each wall. One Friday after sunset, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa saw that his daughter was distraught. Oh, this is perhaps the most famous story of Rabbi Chanina. And he says like this. He saw Rabbi Chanina was known to be poverty-stricken. He was terribly poor. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa saw that his daughter was distraught. He asked her, Biti, my daughter, why are you so sad? And she answered, I mistook by mistake, instead of oil for the Shabbat candles, I put vinegar in the Shabbat candles. And I filled the Shabbos lamps with vinegar. And I'm not going to be able to light the Shabbos candles. I guess you said we don't have oil or it's too late. So I'm not going to be, I can't light candles. Oil is going to sustain the candles. Vinegar is not going to help. To which Rabbi Chanina said to his daughter, and this is the famous words, he says, you shouldn't worry about this. Why? Mi sha'amar l'shemen v'yadlik, yoimar l'choimetz v'yadlik. The one who determined that oil can burn can also determine that vinegar can burn. And she lit the candles, and it burned, and the candles burned so long that she was able to use those same candles that she used in the beginning of Shabbos to use them also for the Havdalah candle at the end of Shabbos. So these are a couple of the stories which it shares about Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, that he had a certain piety, a certain holiness, that he was able to perform open miracles. Actually, one more story, which is not mentioned here, is like this. It says that his wife, again, I mentioned earlier, they were terribly poor. And at one point, his wife just couldn't handle it anymore. And she davened, she prayed to Hashem that they should be blessed, some sort of blessing. And it says literally a hand extended down from heaven with a bar of gold and gave her the bar of gold. That's pretty cool, right? Nice trick. But then Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, that's not the end of the story. The story continues. So Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa came home. His wife told him the story. And perhaps he was there, I'm not sure. And that night he went to sleep. And he had a dream. And in his dream, he would entered his he entered heaven, and he was able to see the world to come. And his world to come was his reward for his life here on earth. And in that world to come, he saw people sitting at tables. And the great righteous people of his generation, the previous generation, sitting at tables. And then finally he came to a table, which he recognized was designated for him, for when his time would arrive. And it says, then he looked down and he noticed that the table only had 3 legs. And he realized that the bar of gold, the wealth, the miraculous bar that his wife had received has been taken from the future reward for him and his wife and him and his family. Therefore, he came back home and he said to her, we can't keep this. We have to send it back. He says he threw it back up and it was gone. It vanished. And the Gemara concludes by saying the greater miracle was not that he received it, but that he was able to give it back. Because as the Talmud says, heaven gives, heaven doesn't take back. When there's a blessing that's given, heaven gives, and a miraculous blessing that heaven gives, it just gives, it doesn't take it back. And Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa had such connection, so to say. He had such holiness. He lived on a different plane. He lived on a miraculous plane, so much so that he was able to say, you know what, thank you for the blessing, but no thank you, take it back. I don't want to pull out from my pull out from my IRA. This is I don't want to pull it out. I'm going to send it back. And this was the miraculous nature of Chanina ben Dosa. Based on this, now I can come back to what the Mishnah says, that when he died, the world has never seen righteousness like Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa since the passing of Chanina ben Dosa. Finally, the Gemara says 2 more things. I'm jumping a little bit. The Mishnah says, Mishemes Rebbe. Once Rebbe died, the great Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, Batla Anava v'yiras chet. There is no longer any humility, and there's no longer any fear of sin. What that means? There's no longer humility and fear of sin to the level of Rebbe. You want to know you wanted to see real humility? Rebbe was the last truly humble person. You want to see true fear of sin? Rebbe was the last one who exhibited that. Okay. On Mem Testament Beis, on 49b, it shares a telling story and part of the tragedy of the downfall of the Jewish people. But it shares a very valuable lesson. And that is like this. One of the, it is well known that the Jewish people, during the times of the Second Temple, towards the end of the Second Temple, were under the control of the Romans. But how did they come to be under the control of the Romans? The Romans were in control for the last, I don't know exactly how much, maybe 150 years. How did the Romans come to be in control of Judea? So you would think it's because the Romans marched in and conquered it. No, that's not how it happened. As is often the case, the problem started from within. And basically, the story of the destruction, the story of the Roman entry and ultimately control over Israel started as follows. There was a king whose name was King Alexander Yanai. He was the son of Yochanan Hyrcanus. He was the son of Shimon, son of Matisyahu Kohen Gadol. So Matisyahu Kohen Gadol is the Maccabee, right? The father of the 5 Maccabees. Matisyahu and his sons, the Maccabees, along with their army, were able to establish independence from the Greek rulers, right? That's the Hanukkah story. The Hanukkah story is that Matisyahu and the Maccabees established independence from the Greeks. All right, so Matisyahu was then the king, or the leader of the Jewish people. He was succeeded by his son Shimon. Shimon was one of the Maccabees. Shimon was the successor of Matisyahu. Shimon was succeeded by his son Yochanan Hyrcanus. Yochanan Hyrcanus, the grandson of Matisyahu, and his son was Alexander Yanai. So you have 4 generations of rulers. Again, Matisyahu, Shimon, Yochanan Hyrcanus, and Alexander Yanai. 4 kings. when Alexander Yanai passes away, so who succeeds him? For a short while, it's his wife who succeeds him. And her name was Queen Alexandra Shlomit Alexandra, who was actually a very righteous woman. So she is, you could say, the fifth in the Chashmonai, in the Hasmonean dynasty, she's the fifth. And when she dies, here is where the problem arises. Because she leaves behind two sons. One son is named Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus is her firstborn son. He should be the king, but she also has another son whose name is Aristobulus. He is the second son and the younger son. Aristobulus does not want to concede the kingdom to his brother. Aristobulus, who's the younger son, if I recall correctly, is the more powerful of the two, and therefore he believes he should be the king, even though his older brother, perhaps according to the system, should have been the king. Aristobulus does not want to concede the throne to his brother, and he begins a civil war against his brother. Now, the brothers at the time, each of the brothers is looking to gain the upper hand against their brothers. So you have Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, both sons. This is approximately 100. This is approximately maybe 130. This is 40 years BCE. Talking the calendar years, 40 years BCE. This is this era. So what do they do to gain the upper hand in this civil war? They reach out to the Roman leader at the time, whose name is Pompey. And they ask Pompey, each of them turns to Pompey, asking him to come in and give them, by joining their forces, he'll give them the upper hand to overcome. Each one, I think, reaches out to Pompey to give the Roman general at the time. And Pompey sees this as an opportunity not to help the brothers, but to help himself. Given the invitation by both sides to bring his armies into Israel, he takes that invitation, but instead takes the power all for himself. And that's how the Roman conquest of Israel began. This is over 100 years before the destruction of the temple. But the Roman conquest begins not because there were some outside forces of Rome decide we want to conquer Israel. It's because the Jewish people can't get along. Because there's a civil war among the two kings, the two brothers in Israel, and they invite the Roman general to come in. And he says, happily, I'm happy to come in, but I'm going to take over if I come in. And that's exactly what happens. And that's why for the last 100 years of the Second Temple, the Jewish people are under Roman control. And this is just a telling example that throughout history, unfortunately, often it is our own undoing. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said this about America. He said that this great country of America is not going to be destroyed or undone by any external power that's going to come in and conquer it. We're too strong for any external power. That's what he said. They're too strong for any outside power to come in and conquer it. However, if it is going to falter, it's going to be because of those on the inside who cannot get along. And this is the president who oversaw lived through the Civil War. So he says, and there's a lot of truth to that in Judaism as well, is that often it is the internal conflict which allows for external powers to come in and take control. Just to conclude with a final couple lines, this is the last two lines of the tractate, and it's very fascinating. If you recall, the Mishnah said that once Rebbe died, there is no longer any real humility in the world, and there's no longer any real fear of sin in the world. I say fear of sin because that's the wording of the Mishnah, not fear of God, fear of sin. That one Rebbe was the last true example of humility and the last true example of fear of sin. Says the Gemara, quoting the Mishnah, Mishameis Rebbe, when Rebbe died, Batlan of Aviras Chet. Humility and fear of sin ceased to exist. Amar le Rabbi Yosef, who lived much later. Yosef was one of the members of the Talmud, said, Amar le Rav Yosef Latana. Rav Yosef heard the Tana, someone who was teaching this Mishnah, heard him say this Mishnah. Said Rav Yosef to the Tana, Lo tisne anava. Don't say that. Don't say that humility ceased to exist. Why? Di'ikana, because I'm here. That's what he says. He says, don't say there's no longer humility. Look at me. I'm here and I'm humble. So therefore, you got to edit this Mishnah. This Mishnah can't be correct because I am here. Di'ika ana, I am here, and therefore, clearly humility still exists. So, the obvious question, which the Talmud which all the commentators say, how do you understand that line? That seems to be that's simple. Imagine you're sitting in a room and you say, whoever's humble, raise your hand. Whoever raises their hands. That's what happens here. He says, he's not just saying I'm humble, he's saying the epitome of humility still exists because I'm here. Because that's the meaning of the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't mean there's no longer any humility. Obviously, there is. All of the examples the Mishnah gave about people, when it says that quality died, it means the apex of that quality to the highest degree. But he's saying, no, the quality to the highest degree still exists because I'm here. So how would you understand the words of Yosef? So I'll take a couple moments to share a couple of the answers given. It's very profound. One answer is given is of this. What was it about Rebbe that made his humility so unique? So one of the, you ever heard the line, don't be so humble, you're not that great, right? Sometimes people are, acting so humble and you tell them, you don't have to be so humble. You're not all that. You can, but the point is, Rebbe was everything. There was very few people. One of the qualities of Rebbe is that he was the greatest Torah scholar of his time, and he was also one of the wealthiest people of his time. He was an extremely wealthy person. He used that wealth and that connection to the Roman government of his time. He used it to bring the sages together and put together the Mishnah. But the quality of humility is most evident with someone who has everything. Someone who is both exceedingly rich as well as exceedingly brilliant and the recognized Torah scholar of his generation, as well as someone who the Talmud describes. We're not just talking about small wealth. He had extreme wealth because he had a very close relationship with the local Roman governor. For such a person to nonetheless have deep humility is the ultimate sign of humility. In other words, not many people can display true humility because one has to have greatness in all areas of life to then also be humble. Someone who has the greatness Rebbe had and then still be humble, that's true humility. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef is saying, there are others, myself, I happen to have wealth and happen to have wisdom, nonetheless, I'm humble. So it wasn't as if he was telling, his response wasn't arrogance. Obviously, it wasn't arrogance. He's saying there's continue to be people who have both the qualities of wealth and wisdom and nonetheless live a humble life. But I want to share another answer. This is the answer really the Rebbe gives. And that is that this Gemara teaches us a lot about what humility is and what it isn't. What humility is not. Often when we think of humility, we think of someone who thinks less of themselves. Humility is someone who thinks less of himself. A humble person is someone who does not think that highly of themselves, does not, if you're to ask a truly humble person, are you unique? They'd say no. Are you brilliant? No, I'm average, I'm below average. That's the common perception of humility, is a person who doesn't think that much of themselves. And arrogance is a person who thinks of themselves to a very high degree. But that's not the essence of humility. The essence of humility is not to downplay one's qualities, one's virtues, one's strengths, because doing so is just dishonesty. We have to be able to identify when humility is dishonesty. If I have a quality and in my humility I say I don't have this quality, that's dishonesty. And it's not a virtue, it's a flaw. Because it means God gave me something or gave me an ability, gave me something that I can't have or I can do that others can't, and I'm denying it. That's not a good thing. Humility is the ability to recognize the qualities you have and be honest about them, but also recognize that it's a gift from God, not to take credit. And that's the key word. Humility is not to take credit for the qualities and abilities and talents that you have, to be aware of them, to be fully aware of them. But at the same time, to say, that doesn't make me better than you. I may have greater wisdom, I may have greater talent, I may have greater ability or whatever it may be, but that doesn't make me better than you, because had God given you the gifts that God had given me, you would be better, you would do more with them than I did with them. And that's the essence of humility. Humility is the ability to recognize and actually and truly recognize the gifts we have. We all have gifts, but then to appreciate that it is 100% a gift from Hashem. And therefore, I can't take credit for it, and I certainly can't look down at anybody else for that. We think in life, the people who look down at others, so often that which they have is really is really due to gifts from Hashem. Sometimes it's literally they were gifted things. Otherwise, it may be a talent or an ability or a circumstance or a place they were born into or a random situation that just happened that allowed them to achieve certain things. And therefore, the key to humility, again, is the recognition that I may have a lot more than others have, and I may have talents others don't have. That doesn't make me better because it's entirely the gifts of Hashem. And Rebbe was that. Rebbe was extremely gifted in his wisdom and in his wealth, but he never allowed him to look down at anyone else because he recognized that it all came from Hashem. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, don't say another, the ikana, I have that quality of humility. He's saying the quality of humility continues to exist. It's not, and he wasn't saying I am better than anyone. He says, no, I too have this awareness that everything I have comes from Hashem. To say I am humble is not a very arrogant statement. It simply says, I do not take credit for any of my abilities. I recognize that it's the gifts that God gave me. I'll do my best to use them to the best of my ability. But humility is that's the true meaning of it. In which case, someone who says, by the way, I am that someone who acknowledges that their humility, all what they're really saying is that I acknowledge that whatever I have and whatever I've done is only thanks to the gifts that God has given me. And that's perhaps the most important message we can take away from these final lines, unique lines, strange lines of this Gemara, which is the conclusion of the tractate Sota. All right, we'll stop here. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining here. I don't know if we'll see if we can do a mini Mariv, but either way, all are welcome to join downstairs.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure. Let's see.